Before the spotlight found him, before the record deals and sold-out arenas, there was a quiet man in a dusty hat who refused to play by the world's rules. While the rest of country music reinvented itself with every passing trend, rhinestones, pop beats, neon cowboy hats, one man stood still. He didn't bend to the noise. He didn't chase what was hot. He trusted that who he already was enough. His name was George Strait, a man so calm, so consistent, that people almost missed how powerful he really was. There was no drama, no social media storm, no wild stories to sell. Just a soft voice, a clean guitar, and a truth that never seemed to age. Somehow, while others burned bright and disappeared, he quietly built an empire on silence. But behind that quiet confidence was something deeper: loss, love, patience, and a kind of faith that only comes from long days under an open Texas sky. George Strait didn't just sing country music, he lived it. Every verse felt like the land he came from, solid, simple, and honest. Most artists have to reinvent themselves to survive. George Strait did the opposite. He stayed the same long enough for the world to circle back around and realize that he was right all along. But how did a humble boy from a tiny Texas town become the king of country without ever shouting for the crown? How did a man who hated fame end up defining an entire genre? To understand that, you have to go back to where noise didn't exist, back to the fields and fences of South Texas, where George learned the rhythm that would guide him for life. In the heart of South Texas, the days start early. The sun doesn't wait for anyone, and neither did George Strait's father. George Harvey Strait was born in Poteet, Texas on May 18, 1952, raised in nearby Pearsall, the son of a math teacher turned cattle rancher. His world was made of wide-open land, quiet mornings, and long days that demanded work before words. Out there, reputation wasn't something you advertised. It was something you earned. People didn't talk about being honest. They just were. That's where George learned the first rule that would define him for life: do things right, or don't do them at all. He wasn't the loud kid, the show-off, or the dreamer with a guitar slung over his shoulder. He was the one who listened more than he spoke, who showed up early and stayed late, who did what had to be done. Not because someone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. He mended fences, baled hay, and rode horses before he ever sang a note. It wasn't glamorous, but it was grounding. Those dusty fields became his first teacher, shaping a man who would later carry that same patience into the spotlight. Music, at first, wasn't ambition. It was atmosphere. Something that drifted from the old radios in kitchen windows or echoed from local dance halls where fiddles and steel guitars cried through the night. George didn't plan to chase it. It simply found him. In high school, he picked up a guitar and started learning songs from Merle Haggard and George Jones. Their voices weren't flashy. They were sincere. That's what caught him. That's what made him believe that maybe his quiet way wasn't a weakness after all. He played small gatherings, nothing serious. But even then, people noticed something different. He didn't perform. He meant every line. It was subtle, but magnetic. The kind of honesty you can't fake. And maybe that's why, when life took him far from Texas, that same sense of rhythm, that same simple truth, followed him all the way to the other side of the Pacific. Because George Strait's next chapter didn't begin in a recording studio or a smoky bar. It began in uniform, with a soldier's duty and a young man's heart, learning what it meant to serve something bigger than himself. By 1971, George Strait was no longer just a rancher's son. he was a soldier. Fresh out of high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and soon found himself stationed in Hawaii, thousands of miles from the quiet hills that raised him. The heat was different there, the air heavier, but he didn't know it at the time. But the Army would give him more than a career. It would give him music. Somewhere between the drills and the duty, George picked up his guitar again, and this time, it wasn't just background noise. He formed a small country band with fellow soldiers, calling themselves Rambling Country. They played wherever they could. Base events, local bars, sometimes just for whoever happened to be nearby. There were no spotlights, no screaming crowds, but those moments lit something inside him. He realized the stage didn't have to be big for a song to mean something. Around that same time, George did something even more important. He married his high school sweetheart, Norma. Their love wasn't dramatic or showy, but it was strong, unshakable, a quiet promise that would outlast decades of fame and heartache. While stationed overseas, George began to understand what music really was to him. It wasn't a career, not yet. It was an anchor, a way to connect with home, with purpose, with peace. And like everything else in his life, he didn't rush it. He just kept showing up, guitar in hand, one note at a time. When his service ended and he returned to Texas, the dream didn't come calling right away. He went back to school, studied agriculture, and kept playing on the side. Small clubs, small crowds, but big heart. That's when he joined a band called Ace in the Hole, a name that would quietly become legendary in its own right. At that point, Nashville wasn't paying attention. Record labels were chasing urban cowboy acts, polished, pop-flavored country. But George Strait was old school in the best way. He wore his Wranglers, sang the classics, and didn't care about fitting in. And maybe that's what made him stand out. Because while everyone else was trying to look the part, George was just being it. And it wouldn't be long before the rest of the world started listening. When George came back from the Army, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing a feeling. The kind that only music could give. Back in Texas, the long drives, the open land, and the sound of fiddles in roadside bars pulled him right back into the world he thought he'd left behind. But this time, it was different. Now, he had purpose. Joining Ace in the Hole band was the first real step into that purpose. They were just a group of local dreamers, guys with day jobs, wives, and pickup trucks. But when they played, something clicked. Their sound wasn't fancy. It was rough, real, and proud of its roots. Honky-tonk, fiddle-driven, two-stepping music that reminded people who they were. George wasn't the loudest in the group, but his presence commanded attention. He didn't need to move much on stage, just stood there with that still posture, hat low, and a voice that could silence a room. Listeners felt like he was singing for them, not at them. Every lyric carried the weight of honesty. But Texas was a long way from Nashville. The band played dance halls, fairs, and bars, sometimes to a handful of people. Nights blurred into mornings, with long drives and low pay. George could have quit. In fact, many did. The country scene was changing fast, and the radio wasn't looking for his kind of sound anymore. But here's the thing, George Strait never did anything halfway. When the doors wouldn't open, he just kept knocking. Then came 1979. A producer named Irv Woolsey, who'd once worked for a record label, saw something in him. George had tried and failed to get Nashville's attention before, but Woolsey believed this was the real deal. He sent George's demo to MCA Records, and this time, someone listened. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. In 1981, George Strait released his first single, Unwound. It was a simple song, nothing fancy, but it hit like lightning. Country fans who'd grown tired of polished, pop-infused Nashville suddenly heard something that sounded true again. George's voice cut through the noise. His sound, twangy, clean, traditional, felt like a return to something people didn't realize they'd been missing. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was authenticity. From that moment, everything started to shift. He wasn't a superstar yet, but the foundation had been laid. One hit led to another, and slowly, George Strait began turning local loyalty into national attention. And while other artists were reinventing themselves to stay relevant, George kept doing what he'd always done: show up, sing his truth, and let the rest fall into place. The cowboy from Texas had finally ridden into the spotlight. But no one could have guessed just how big that light was about to get. It was 1982 when George Strait released Foolhardy Memory. That song didn't just climb the charts, it claimed them. It became his first #1 hit, and the country world officially had a new king in the making. But success didn't change him. While others chased glamour, George still wore the same Wrangler jeans, the same boots, and that same quiet smile. He didn't try to act bigger than he was. If anything, he became smaller, more private, more focused. The fame didn't drive him, the music did. His next albums rolled out like clockwork. Straight from the heart, Right or Wrong, Does Fort Worth Ever Cross Your Mind? Each one carried the same emotional truth that made fans feel like they knew him personally. His voice became a kind of comfort, familiar, steady, and unshakably sincere. And yet, what really separated him wasn't just the sound. It was the discipline. George Strait wasn't one for flashy interviews or dramatic headlines. He didn't live for fame. He lived for precision. Every song he recorded had to mean something. Every performance had to be worth someone's time. That focus made him unstoppable. By the mid-'80s, he was headlining arenas, selling millions, and quietly reshaping country music without ever raising his voice. Critics began to call him the last pure cowboy, a man who brought back the dignity and grit the genre had started to lose. But success is a strange thing. It gives, but it also tests. As George climbed higher, tragedy struck, a moment that would forever change his heart and deepen the meaning behind his music. In 1986, his 13-year-old daughter, Jennifer, was killed in a car accident. Overnight, the man known for his steady composure was shattered. The loss was unbearable. And instead of sharing it publicly, George did what he'd always done. He went quiet. He stopped giving interviews, stopped talking about personal life, and poured every bit of pain into his music. He never wrote songs about the tragedy directly, but fans could hear it. The emotion in his performances grew heavier, deeper, more spiritual. Tracks like Baby Blue and You'll Be There later carried the echoes of that grief. And maybe that's when people realized George Strait wasn't just a singer. He was a storyteller who carried his truth in silence. He turned loss into something beautiful, something that gave comfort to millions who'd felt their own pain. Even in heartbreak, he stayed true to his roots, quiet, strong, and faithful. The cowboy who once sang for fun was now singing to survive. But out of that storm came something extraordinary, a renewed strength that would carry him into a golden era where every song, every concert, and every note felt like a piece of his soul. After tragedy, most people slow down. They take time to breathe, to heal. But George Strait, he found healing in the one thing that had always been there, the music. He didn't talk about his pain, but you could feel it in every note. That quiet strength turned into something powerful, something that carried him through the next 2 decades like a river that never stopped moving. By the late 1980s, George Strait wasn't just a star. He was becoming a symbol of what real country music sounded like. While Nashville flirted with pop trends, George stayed steady, and fans rewarded him for it. Song after song, album after album, hits like The Chair, Oceanfront Property, Amarillo by Morning, and All My Exes Live in Texas became timeless classics. Each one sounded simple, but beneath that simplicity was perfection, precise production, heartfelt lyrics, and a voice that never cracked under pressure. His tours started selling out faster than anyone in the business. Crowds filled stadiums just to watch a man who barely moved on stage. No dance routines, no flashing lights. Just George, his guitar, and a voice that carried across generations. He didn't need theatrics, because authenticity was the show. But while the spotlight grew brighter, George stayed exactly the same. He still lived on his ranch, spent his free time riding horses, and kept his private life private. Fame didn't change him. It just revealed how rare he really was. In 1992, George made a bold move. He starred in a film called Pure Country. It wasn't just another movie. It was almost like a reflection of his own life. The story followed a country singer who gets lost in the fame machine and has to find his way back to his roots. The film didn't break box office records, but the soundtrack? It exploded. Songs like I Cross My Heart and Heartland became wedding anthems and national favorites. That album alone reminded people that George Strait didn't just make music, he made memories. Through the 90s and early 2000s, his reign only grew stronger. He broke records once held by legends like Conway Twitty and Merle Haggard. By the time the new millennium rolled in, George had more #1 singles than any other artist in country history. Think about that. Not just for his era, but of all time. But even then, he didn't brag. When reporters asked how he felt about being called the king of country, he'd just smile and say something like, "I'm just a singer from Texas." That's what made him untouchable, his humility. The more he achieved, the less he talked about it. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. And yet, behind that calm exterior, a thought began to form. After decades on the road, thousands of shows, and millions of fans, George started to wonder, how much longer could he keep this pace? How long could the cowboy ride before he had to hang up his saddle? That question would soon lead him to a decision that stunned the entire music industry. By 2012, George Strait had already done what most artists only dream of: decades of success, millions of albums sold, and a career built entirely on staying true to himself. But even legends get tired. So one quiet morning, he gathered his team and said something no one expected to hear. He wasn't quitting music, but he was ready to say goodbye to the road. The announcement of his Cowboy Rides Away tour hit fans like a shockwave. The man who had been the heartbeat of country music for over 30 years was stepping back. But in true George Strait fashion, he didn't make it dramatic. There was no press stunt, no emotional farewell speech, just a simple message: it's time. Each show on that final tour felt sacred. Fans came from all over the world, not just to hear the songs, but to be part of something that would never happen again. You could feel the weight of it, every lyric, every silence between chords. George didn't perform for applause, he performed for connection, for gratitude. When the final show arrived in 2014 at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, over 104,000 people filled the stands, the largest single-ticketed concert in U.S. history. Legends from every corner of country music joined him on stage, but the spotlight never wavered from the quiet man in the hat. When he sang "The Cowboy Rides Away," it wasn't just a song. It was a farewell letter to an era. But the beautiful part? He never really rode away. After his tour ended, George didn't disappear into the sunset. He returned to his ranch, spent time with his family, and recorded new music on his own terms. Albums like Cold Beer Conversation and Honky Tonk Time Machine proved that his voice and his message were timeless. Even as the industry changed around him, George Strait stayed rooted. Younger artists started calling him their hero. His songs became the blueprint for what real storytelling in country music should sound like. And through it all, George never changed his rhythm. He still kept things simple. No scandals, no headlines, no desperate need for relevance. Because George Strait never chased fame. He chased truth. He showed the world that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be honest, patient, and unshakably yourself. That's why, even after hundreds of hits and decades of glory, his legacy doesn't feel like it's fading. It feels eternal, as long as there are people who crave real music, the kind that sounds like open skies and long roads. George Strait's voice will still be there, calm, steady, and true. The cowboy didn't ride away. He just found a quieter trail to follow. When the crowds finally went home and the lights faded, George Strait was still the same man he'd always been. The quiet cowboy who preferred the company of family and open land to flashing cameras. And maybe that's the biggest mystery of all. How does someone become that famous and yet stay so completely grounded? It's because George never let the world define who he was. Fame wasn't something he chased. It was something that caught up to him. Even when his name became legend, he lived his life by the same simple rules he learned as a boy. Work hard, stay humble, tell the truth, and let your actions speak louder than your words. He spent most of his time on his ranch near San Antonio, tending cattle, riding horses, and enjoying the peace of Texas skies. To him, success wasn't the awards on his shelf. It was the quiet mornings spent in the saddle, the family dinners, the laughter that no one else ever saw. Norma, his wife, was always by his side, the same woman who stood with him before the fame, before the heartbreak, before the world called him king. Their marriage, which has lasted more than 5 decades, is something rare even outside the spotlight, let alone in the entertainment world. For George, love and loyalty weren't something to be sung about. They were lived. He said it many times in subtle ways. You can have all the success in the world, but if you don't have someone to share it with, it doesn't mean much. That's the man behind the music, not the celebrity, but the husband, the father, the friend. After losing his daughter, George and Norma became even more private, but they turned their pain into purpose. The Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation was born, a charity supporting children's causes, quietly funded and managed with care, without fanfare or publicity. He never used it as a headline. He just helped people because it was the right thing to do. And that's the paradox of George Strait. The man who could fill a stadium of 100,000 people never needed attention. The man whose voice reached millions spoke through silence more than words. Even his fellow musicians saw it. Artists like Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, and Chris Stapleton often talk about how George's calm leadership shaped them. He never gave long lectures or advice, just led by example. If he said he'd be somewhere, he was there early. If he promised something, he did it right. In an era where image often overshadows talent, George Strait reminded the world that character still matters. He didn't have to reinvent himself, didn't need scandals or shock value. He just needed his voice, his guitar, and his truth. Because when the music stops and the crowd goes quiet, what people remember isn't who shouted the loudest, it's who stayed the truest. And George Strait, more than anyone else, never stopped being true. Every generation has its stars, but every few decades, someone comes along who becomes more than just a name. They become a standard. For country music, that standard is George Strait. His voice became a measure of authenticity, his songs a map of American life. You can trace entire eras of the genre through his music, from the honky-tonk grit of the 80s to the heartfelt ballads of the 2000s. Yet through it all, his style never needed updating because it was timeless from the start. You see, most artists chase trends. George created a lane so pure that everyone else ended up following it. Newer singers, from Luke Combs to Cody Johnson, openly admit that without George Strait, their music wouldn't exist. He didn't just shape a sound, he preserved a heritage. Even now, in his 70s, he still performs with the same poise and precision. No overproduction, no fireworks, just a stage, a mic, and a crowd that knows every lyric by heart. And when he sings, you realize something. George Strait isn't performing for people, he's performing with them. His music has become a shared language, something that connects fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, generations to one another. Because when George Strait finally hangs up his hat for good, there won't be another like him. There will be talented singers, sure, maybe even some great ones. But the kind of quiet confidence he carried, the ability to move millions without ever saying too much, that's not something you can copy. It's something you're born with. George Strait didn't just define country music, he defined grace. And as the years go by, one truth will remain. Kings may come and go, but the king of country will always ride tall, steady as ever, somewhere under that endless Texas sky.